Hello world, this is Lisa Friedrichsen, your friend and computer science professor with another short screencast about Access. And this time we're going to talk about combo boxes, using combo boxes for data entry. Now lots of times people will call this a drop-down list, and it is, but technically it's called a combo box in Access. And the reason for that, because it's a combination between a list and a text box. Now you can modify a combo box's properties so that it cannot be used to enter in any value other than the list. And we're going to look at a combo box's most important properties in design view of this product's form. So let's go to design view and open up the property sheet for this first combo box. And the most important property of any control that's used for data entry is on the data tab, the control source property, because that determines what field you're updating when you pick a value off of the list. The second most important property for a combo box is this row source property, because it determines the source of the data for the rows. And we see the type of the source is a table or a query, and we see the select SQL keyword. And that means it's selecting distinct values, including the supplier ID from the suppliers table. Let's click the build button, and we'll see that both the supplier ID and the company name are being selected for that combo box. If I hit my datasheet view button, I see both the supplier ID as well as its company name. So that's the source of the data for the drop-down list. And there's 30 different suppliers here. So let's close that and go back to this control source. We're connecting this combo box to the supplier ID field. But when we're in form view, we're only seeing the supplier's name. We're not seeing that number. And the reason is because we identify our suppliers by their name. We haven't necessarily memorized their number. It's much easier to pick Tokyo Traders than to supplier 29. So let's look in design view again at those properties, and we'll see that while we're selecting the supplier ID and the supplier name from the suppliers table, over here on the format tab, we are identifying two columns in our drop-down list, but the first column's width is 0. So that's why we're not seeing that supplier ID. I can change that real quick, ½ inch, and save and view, and then I would see supplier ID numbers in front of the supplier names. Let's say I want to show both the name and the number on the drop-down list, but after I choose a name, I want to show that supplier. So that will help us really understand what properties control this combo box. So back to design view, what I can do if I want to show both the number and the name, but show the name later, is change the order in which I've selected these fields. I'm going to go back to this row source property and put the company name as the first column so that it's always selected and shown when I choose a value from that drop-down list. And I'm going to look at it in datasheet view. Yes, this is how I want my list to show up, with the company name first and then the supplier ID second. Okay, back to design view. I'm going to close this and save the changes so that my SQL statement updates so the company name is first. But now I have to change my bound column because I'm still updating that number, which is now the second column. I also want to point out this limit to list property while we're here on the data tab. That will limit my users' entries to just the list. I don't want to allow them to use it as a text box and type in a new supplier. Now, if you wanted to do that, there's a couple other properties that allow you to edit the list and even open up a specific form so that you can edit the list. But we're going to say for this screencast, no. All we're going to allow the user to do is pick a supplier ID off the list, and we'll do that by saying limit to list yes. Now on the Format tab, I have to change my column widths. I need to make the company name be 2½ inches wide, and the supplier ID value, if I want to show that, I'm going to make that ½ inch wide. Now, whenever you change your column widths, you might also change the width property to make sure that it's wide enough to show the cumulative value of all your column widths. And I'm also going to change the list rows value here from the default 16 to 99, because that will make the list bigger, and so the users will have to scroll less. Now, I don't think you can see 99 suppliers on the screen at the same time, but 99 is a nice number that will make it as large as it needs to be. Certainly we can see 30 suppliers on the screen. So those are the key properties on the Data tab and also on the Format tab that you need to be aware of to make this combo box work the way you want it to work. I'm going to save and look at this form and form view, and now I've got a wider list and I've got both the supplier's name as well as their number. But once I choose a supplier, I only need to see their name. But if I'm curious or if it's helpful to show other information on that list, then I can do that as well by knowing about these properties. Now I want to say one more thing about combo boxes. Let's go back to design view. If I delete the supplier ID combo box and open up my add existing fields and then drag that field in from the field list, then I've noticed that the default control that I'm getting here is a combo box. It's not a text box. So for supplier ID, I automatically got a combo box and a label. And why is that? And I want to save this and show you why that field automatically wants to be a combo box instead of a text box. And that goes back to the properties of that field in the table. So let's look at the products table in design view, and let's look at that supplier ID field. When I click on the supplier ID field, I see its properties in the properties pane. One of the most important properties is that it's a numbered data type. So it does store the supplier ID numbers, and that's actually the foreign key field to the suppliers table, because one supplier can provide many products. But what makes it into a combo box when it's added to a form are the properties on the Lookup tab. The properties on the Lookup tab say that it should be displayed as a combo box, and here is the row source property that determines the entries in the list that is shown when this field is on a data sheet or on a form. If we go to data sheet view and we go over to that supplier field, we have these lookup properties that give this field this drop-down feel. Now, inherent to this discussion is which field should have lookup properties. Any field that has a finite number of valid entries should have lookup properties. And it's really nice when those values are stored in a table. So the categories for each product are stored in the categories table. Suppliers for each product are stored in the suppliers table. If I open up the suppliers table, I add a new supplier. Let's just go to the end of the data sheet here and add in AAA Great Supplier Company, and I'll add my husband as the contact name. I save this table. Given that this supplier field is looking up values from the suppliers table, when I open it up again, I'm going to see that new supplier automatically added to the list. So that's the great thing about these lookup properties, is if you're looking up row source for the list from a table or a query, as that table gets updated, you will automatically see those entries added to that drop-down list. So again, let's go back to our basics, our relationships between our tables. We're looking at this supplier ID field in the products table. Notice that it's the foreign key field to the suppliers table. Similarly, the category ID field is the foreign key field to the categories table. So that would imply that both of these fields have lookup properties, so that as categories are added or as suppliers are added, those drop-down lists will automatically have those new values when I pull supplier ID field or the category ID field out of the products table. So what fields are good candidates for lookup properties? All of the foreign key fields. All of the foreign key fields are typically numbers, because numbers are typically used to uniquely identify a record. A product ID or a supplier ID or a category ID, these are all numbers. But when we want to know the supplier's name or the category name or the product name, we want to go through that number and look up a more meaningful piece of data out of that field. So lookup properties are typically added to foreign key fields or any other field that has a limited number of valid entries. If you want more information about one-to-many relationships between the tables, please go back to my playlist, because if this is not set up correctly, nothing else works in the application. But if this is set up correctly, then even things like using the form wizard or adding a combo box to a form work beautifully. In our next screencast, we're going to talk about a different way to use combo boxes, and that is to find records. So combo boxes have two completely different behaviors. In this screencast, we talked about its first and primary use, which is to modify data on a record. In the next screencast, we're going to talk about its secondary purpose, which is to find records. Thank you.